All right, hey everybody, welcome back. Good to see you guys. Good afternoon. Happy Monday. It is April the 20th. This is Monday, April the 20th, 2020. This is for our Cal State Fullerton Intro to Philosophy class, 2:30 to 3:45 lecture period. So welcome back, everybody. Hope you guys had a great weekend. Today we're going to finish up all of the last few leftover pieces of information from the time subject, and then we're going to start to talk about a new topic today, and that's the philosophy of mind, which is one of the subjects that are optional for the prompts that you guys are working on for your final paper. So this is a key lecture for those that want to learn a little bit about this new topic. Okay, good. So welcome back, everybody. Good to see you guys here. Hope you're doing really well, staying healthy and safe. Anybody can just chime in, say hi at any point in time, and it's always great to hear from you guys. So welcome back. We've had a great weekend, and we're just going to get into this lecture for today, and then we'll be good to go for today's meeting. Hi, Andy, everybody, Isabel. Will we be learning this week the topics of Essay 2? Let me double check what your question is, because hold on a second. One second while I open a different window. Hi guys, hello. Just give me 2 minutes. Okay, yeah, so is it Isabel? I see the comment there. If you're asking about the essay prompt, this is why I was confused for a minute, because I definitely remember that I gave it to you guys, and I did, so it's been with you already for like a week. I gave them out last week. We talked about them in the live stream, and there's a titanium message that I sent to everybody, which has the attachment of the prompts and which discusses those topics. So go back, watch the live stream of the previous meeting if you want to see me speak about it in this live stream kind of format. But also, oh, thanks, Abraham. Yeah, I don't know. It's coming in, isn't it? It's getting really long. This is quarantine, quarantine style, so not to worry. But yes, go ahead. Yeah, you'll see the prompts there. So that's been delivered out. Don't miss it. Don't forget it. It's due. I changed the due date to May the 4th. So make note of that. That's been adjusted from, sorry, I'm misspeaking. It's actually been adjusted to Wednesday the 6th. Okay, so it is Wednesday, May the 6th. That's the last day of lecture. That's when we decided to make it due. So just know that. It's due Wednesday, May 6th. That's an adjustment of 1 week, and that's about it. Star Wars Day, May the 4th be with you. Oh, oops. Yeah, sorry. It would have been, but I guess it's not going to be. Anyways, guys, yes. So any questions ever, about the class, about the order of assignments or lectures, whatever, just always feel free to ask. When we're here together in these live streams, it's a great opportunity for me to just take questions from you on anything, but also, I'm constantly looking at my emails, and I'm happy to, and I do answer questions that way quite frequently. As we get closer to the due date, as we get closer to May 6th, some of you might be working on drafts of your paper or whatever, and if you are, then just, send me a draft and I'll give you some comments, as long as I have a little bit of time before it's due to look it over, probably in the weekend leading up to May 6th. That would be a good time if anyone does have any interest in getting a little bit of feedback. So I'm just willing to help in whatever way I can, but one of the tools that you can use is getting it proofread and examined by me before you submit it, so that I could tell you where there are some things that you might be able to fix, and that can always improve anybody's score, usually does. So just putting that out there. I've mentioned before, but just to remind you. So yes, guys, we're getting close to 2:30. We've got about a minute, and then we'll go on and get right into today's stuff. All right, guys. Well, I mean, just a few seconds left over till 3, but might as well get underway. Welcome back, all of you guys. Good to see you here. It's Monday, April the 20th, and we have an important lecture today where we're going to finish up the last few items within philosophy of time, and we're going to open the door to one of our last topics in this class, and that's the philosophy of mind. Okay, so going back for a moment to review last lecture and take you up to where we were at. So these authors on time. First of all, Albert Einstein shows the reader that the concept of two events being simultaneous is relative. He shows that by the example of these two lightning bolts. So if there are two lightning bolts that strike at 2 points of a railway, the question he asked was, what does it mean to say they're simultaneous? And he knows that a lot of people might just shrug their shoulders and be like, what? I mean, simultaneous, they happen at the same time. But he says that's not good enough, though. We need to have a more definite, precise explanation of what simultaneous means so that we could actually conduct an experiment to test whether the two things were simultaneous. How can we test for this? So he says, here's the way you would test it. Put an observer at the exact midpoint between the two strikes. Make sure he can see the 2 points in one field of vision. If we assume that the speed of light is always the same, then in case both of the light signals from A and B reach him at the midpoint at the same time, we would say that those two events were simultaneous. Why? Because given that he's at the midpoint, the light has traveled an equal distance to reach M from both sources. If they've traveled an equal distance, reach a common endpoint at the same moment, and have traveled that equal distance, reaching the same endpoint, traveling at the same velocity, then they must have been emitted from A and B at the same time, which means that they were simultaneous, but only relative to that observer. If we take a second observer, place them on a moving train, and have them traveling through the scene in the direction toward B away from A, then as they traverse the midpoint, M prime, if they move past that midpoint exactly at the moment while the first observer standing still at M conducts his observation, then the second observer would not see A and B simultaneously, and it is because since he's moving, his velocity will carry him closer to B, further from A, so those two light signals that would have been seen simultaneously from an observer at rest at the midpoint are not going to be seen simultaneous for the moving observer, because basically it's a shorter distance between his body and the emission point B, and a growing and larger distance since he's in a state of motion from the left light beam. So he'll see B and then A. Therefore, the two events can't be stated with objective clarity to be simultaneous or non-simultaneous. It just depends on the relative context of the observer, their velocity relative to other observers, and the events observed. Okay, so after that, it was Ted Sider. Ted Sider said, it's hard to analyze time because when you think about it, we say that time moves, but that's a problem because it's not so easy to explain what it means that time moves. Why is that so difficult and puzzling? Because when we say that anything moves, what we usually mean is that it's at different places at different times. That's like what just motion through space is. But if time is moving, then that would have to somehow mean that time is in different places at different times, and that's how it moves. But now we're using time to defend or explain how it is that it itself moves, which is circular and invites a regress. So anyway, there's no good way to talk about how time moves. Even saying the present moment moves would be to say that it moves relative to some sort of time that's changing positions within. So instead of all that movement stuff, he says, let's just go with the space-time theory, and according to it, time does not move. It just sits there and contains all the events, past, present, and future, all located within the big framework of space-time. So to explain how that theory is to be understood, space-time theory, he shows us these space-time diagrams, which basically graph the existence of an object across all the points in space-time at which it does exist. And according to that framework, we are built out of both spatial and also temporal parts. Temporal part is an object at a moment of time, like what, for example, you see in a photograph of a person, just one still frame. It's one moment of their existence, but if you took the set aggregate of all of them, then that's what you are overall. And according to this notion of space-time, each of the temporal parts is real, not just the present one that's watching this lecture right now, but also all the future bits and the past ones too. He says that when you think about space-time theory, you're starting to see that space and time are more similar than most people ordinarily realize. The three similarities that he mentioned were, number one, in terms of reality, objects far away in space are just as real as the ones that are close. Same with time. Moments that are far away in time from the present are just as real as the present. Second similarity in terms of parts, objects take up space by having spatial parts, objects take up time by having temporal parts. And then the third similarity was in terms of the words here and now. They're both relative words. Where is here at? It's just wherever a speaker speaks the word when they speak it. Whereas when is the time now? It's just whenever the speaker uses the term now. So they're both relative to the context of the speaker. Then, okay, we briefly started to talk about David Lewis. And I just wanted to add a couple of last points from the David Lewis article, since I don't want to leave those things unmentioned. So just a brief detour back into the writing of David Lewis before we close up this whole subject of time. Okay, David Lewis is a great American philosopher of the 20th century. He lived from 1941 until 2001, and in 1976 he wrote a paper called The Paradoxes of Time Travel. Now, in that paper, he has a pretty, in a way, simple thesis that he's trying to defend. He's just trying to make the case that time travel is theoretically possible. It's not impossible, is what he's saying. It's something that maybe sounds weird, and when you think through some of these time travel scenarios, it might be a little bit mind-bending or odd, but he says it's just odd. It doesn't mean that it's actually literally impossible. So his goal in the paper is to try and convince any reader that there's nothing literally impossible about the idea of time travel. It is something that is at least logically capable of happening. But in order for him to make the case that it's possible, he has to sort of show that paradoxes of time travel do not indicate that it's literally inconceivable. So to start off, he wants to define what time travel is, and he puts it this way. It is a discrepancy between two different measurements of time. And I mean, this, by the way, is all new, right? I didn't talk to you guys about this stuff about the David Lewis, except I briefly mentioned the grandfather paradox. Isn't that correct? If my memory serves me, we were very light and sketchy on the David Lewis, and I just kind of told you, okay, imagine a situation where you try to go back to the past. Okay, good, Caitlin, so just thank you for that. So time travel, as Lewis would define it, is this. It's a discrepancy between two different measurements of time. And, okay, thank you guys, Abraham and Julian and everyone else. Very helpful, okay? So about that, what is this definition saying? All right, so take this case, for example. Say that somebody, here's the person, walks into a cylinder like this. Now they're in the cylinder. Let's say when they walk in, their clock says 9:55 a.m. Okay, and they're wearing a watch on their wrist, and the watch shows 5 minutes of time passing for this person. So they spend 5 minutes, according to their wristwatch, inside of the machine. Now they get out of there after that time. They emerge from this cylinder thing, and now they're outside of it. Okay, so I have a question, right? What if the time on the clocks when the person gets out of the machine, I'm not talking about his wristwatch, but what if the time on all the external clocks, they show 10 a.m.? Does that mean that our man traveled through time, or did he not? So you understand my question. He got in there. It was 9:55 according to his watch. 5 minutes passed by and he gets out. If all the watches outside show 10 a.m., did this man actually travel through time or not? Question then. What do you think? Just try to follow that question. He gets in when it's 9:55, spends 5 minutes in there. He gets out and all the watches, they say 10 a.m. So does that mean he really traveled through time, or did he not? Good, Kenzie. No, that means that he didn't travel through time. That means that this is not a time machine, but just like a shipping container that he walked into, stood there for 5 minutes, and got out. That's like getting into a closet, sitting there for 5 minutes, walking out 5 minutes later. That's not really time travel, right? Or if it is, then I guess we're all time travelers in that sense, right? But it's kind of boring time travel. It's like, for example, me and you, we've been watching this lecture. Well, I've been delivering it. You've been watching it. But since 2:30, right? So you might say since 2:30, all of us have traveled through time, 9 minutes or 10 minutes to the present moment. But that's not really the kind of time travel that is spoken of in science fiction scenarios, right? It's not like the slow and steady march from the past to the future at a rate of 1 hour per hour. So if it's actual time travel, right, then when he gets out of this machine, even though his clock would say 10 a.m., if he travels, let's say, 2 hours to the future, then what should the clock say external to his watch on his wrist? Say that this man got in, spent 5 minutes on his watch, but when he gets out, it's a 2-hour travel to the future. So that means that what should the clocks outside show in that scenario of 2-hour future travel for our time traveler? It shouldn't say 10 a.m. on all the external clocks. It should show a different time. What should the time shown on every other clock be for this 2-hour time traveler? 12 p.m. noon, exactly. Well, you say 11:55. He did spend, the 5 minutes, so 2 hours plus, right? So that would be a case of 2 hours into the future, time travel. What's his wristwatch say when he gets out? 10. What do the other watches all say when he gets out? 12. And it is 12, it's like 2 hours into the future. If he traveled into the past, right, suppose he's not a future time traveler, but he wants to go back in time, then his watch will say 10 a.m., but all the external clocks will have to show some kind of time and date that is prior to 10 a.m. on that particular date, right? So suppose that he travels, 8 hours into the past. Then when he gets out, his watch will show 10 a.m., but all the external clocks will say 2 a.m. So he's moved 8 hours prior in time. Now, here's one paradox, first possible paradox. Let's try to just draw the numbering again, that's partially erased. So here's one possible paradox that David Lewis mentions. How can the same two events be separated by two different amounts of time? That's one possible paradox that he wants to, wrestle with here in the beginning. So I have like a little trick question for you. Okay, let's see. If you're clever, I think you'll probably catch on to my question, but let's go with the situation shown here in this little diagram. He got in the machine. On his watch, it says 5 minutes passed. When he gets out, his watch says 10. But all the other clocks outside that are not on his wrist, they're all showing 12, okay? So let's say that's a 2-hour trip to the future, but question, how much time was in between him stepping in the cylinder and getting out? What's the answer to that question? How much time passed between when the man gets in and when the man gets out? What do you say is the answer to that? I'm giving you a hint. It's kind of like a trick question because it sounds like there's two ways to answer this question, sort of. But let's see what you think. Okay, so Abraham, one thing you could say is this 5 minutes, right? Because that's what he did experience. It would be like him getting in there, like 5 minute song on the radio plays. When he gets out, he's out, and it says 10 on his watch. But another answer, and I think that's what you're pointing out, Nicole, could be 2 hours, right? Because everybody else outside the machine, right, they would have seen him step in there, and they would have seen him emerge at 12 noon. And they would have all spent 2 hours watching the machine. But his experience in the machine would have been a 5 minute trip. So what's the correct answer? Did it take 5 minutes between when it gets in and when it gets out? Or did it take 2 hours between when it gets in and gets out? Sounds like we got two different answers, and that might strike you as a paradox. Because it sounds like a paradox, right? What if you ask somebody, so they just took a flight from New York to California, and you ask them, how was your flight? How long was the flight? And they say it was an interesting flight. It took me 6 hours, and it also took me 2 hours. So that's how long it took, 6, but also 2. You would look at the person like, are you losing your mind? What are you saying? You can't be giving me 2 answers. I asked you how long it took, and you said 2 different amounts that are not the same. So it might sound like this is literally impossible, but David Lewis says not so fast. There's actually a way of making these two things coherently make sense. Okay, so what he mentions next is the introduction of 2 different time frames, personal versus external time. So let me put that up here. 2 time frames. Okay, so first of all, personal time versus, on the other hand, external time. All right, so first of all, personal time. What is that? That is the time as experienced by the individual person, time traveler, as shown on their personal wristwatch. So time experienced by time as experienced by the time traveler. External time would be time as experienced and measured by all external observers and clocks. Measured by all external observers and clocks. So once we employ this distinction of 2 different time frames, we can eliminate the paradox that I just mentioned about how much time passed between when he got in and when he got out of the machine. So maybe you're kind of catching on a little. So what's the right way to diagnose the case? When we ask you how much time passed for our example of the time traveler, we would say that it was 5 hours of which kind of time? Sorry, I'm giving you the wrong question. Let me repeat the question. We would say that it is 5 minutes, okay, 5 minutes of which kind of time that elapses between when he gets in and gets out of the machine. It was 5 minutes of blank. What? How long did it take him in between getting in and getting out? Well, 5 minutes of personal time, yes, but 2 hours of external time. And there's actually no contradiction between the 2 ways of recording the amount of time, because as the space-time theory of Einstein indicates, we actually all do occupy our own personal time frame. Now, why is it that in our everyday lives, personal time perfectly coincides with external time? Why is it that my 1 hour span is the same as yours and is the same as everyone else's and all our clocks are basically in sync? Well, it is because we just don't have the means or technology to achieve the very extreme divergent speeds that would cause time dilation to take effect in an observably measurable way. But that is exactly the prediction of the theory, so it's not therefore theoretically inconceivable that my 5 minutes could be everyone else's 2 hours, 3 months, years. Just depends on the rate of travel that I have at what velocity in comparison to other observers that possess less velocity. So yes, that's one paradox that gets explained away. 5 minutes of time relative to the individual's experience, 2 hours relative to the external conditions of other observers. And if he went into the past, we would say he went through 5 minutes of personal time, but minus, 8 hours or whatever of external time. This is what David Lewis says we can use to make sense of what might sound like totally incoherent sentences. Take a time travel scenario where somebody says, check this out, in 10 minutes, I'm going to be in the year 2050. That sounds like it makes no sense, because it sounds like in 10 minutes, I'll be ahead 30 years. But now we can make sense of such statements. In 10 minutes of personal time, I'll be 30 years ahead in external time. So one paradox has been eliminated. And I'm just going to quickly mention a couple of the others before I close this topic off for good. Another possible paradox that the author mentions is, suppose that you went back in time and you had a phone call with your previous self, like when you were younger. So maybe you want to go back to 2016 and tell your younger, maybe high school age self what to expect from college, from, I don't know, political developments that will happen, the coronavirus. You just want to tell them stuff, give them a heads up, get them prepared, right? So you go back and you make a call. You travel back starting today, like say tomorrow the time machines come out, you get in one, you go back to 2016, and now you're placing a call, let's say, to your younger self. Question, how many people are having the phone call, you think? What's the answer to that? What do you think would be the number? Talking to yourself in the past. You're the time traveler from the future, going back, talking to yourself in the past. What do you say? How many people are having a conversation in that hypothetical scenario? What would be your way of looking at it? Okay, Caitlin, you're saying 1. Now, that's a good answer, but I hope understand, like some of you guys might have thought, well, it seems like it's 2. Because to all external observers, to all appearances, it's 2 people. One person sending the call, another person in another part of space receiving the call. It looks like that's 2 different bodies. How could that be 1 person? Well, what David Lewis says is that the most reasonable answer to this is that it is actually just 1 person. So if it's 1 person, then what are these 2 things that are communicating? Not 2 different people, but 2 what of the same person? Let's see if you can remember some of our terminology here. In this situation I'm describing, the phone call is ongoing between not 2 people, but 2, what do you think you could call them? The sender and the receiver of our phone call would be 2 what, perhaps? Let's see if you can think of the proper term. Yes, 2 temporal parts of the same person. So there's one, that's the later stage of the individual, communicating with the prior stage of the individual. So there's not actually 2 people, but 2 temporal parts of the same person. If they were 2 totally different people, then let's say the later stage of the person would not have any memory of having been the person receiving the call. But since this is 1 person and 2 temporal parts of them, there's psychological linkage and continuity between the previous temporal parts and the later ones. So it would be more reasonable to describe this not as 2 different separate people, but 2 stages of the same person. And to make that even more clear, let me go back to the space-time diagram really fast. So here, let's say, is a graph. This is the t-axis for time, and then we have these 2 other spatial dimensions, x and y here. So say a person's born in 2000, and their timeline streaks to the right as they continue to, exist. But then in 2020, a decision is made to travel into the past, right? So the person goes back to 2016, this point in the timeline. All right. Now, because the individual goes back to 2016, if we cut a cross-section between previous points in the space-time diagram, you'd only see 1 temporal part existing in space at that particular point in the graph. But because this individual's made a trip back, the zigzag structure of the temporal worm now will show 2 parts. The initial part in the stream from 2016, and now the subsequent part later that's making this visit to the past. Notice that there's just 1 continuous streak, but since he's made a return trip, there's 2 points in the same sequence in the same part of space. If he gets back to 2020 and decides, wait a minute, I left my AirPods back in 2016, I need to go collect those. So he takes a second trip back. Then in this case, there's going to be 3 temporal parts of him located in the universe at the same time because he's done this double trip back. So anyway, with each additional trip back, there's going to be an additional temporal part of him co-located in space at the same time. With me and you, because I guess we don't travel through time, or maybe we never will, we are just going to be a continuous rightward-facing streak that never has this zigzagging back in the temporal dimension. but it's not theoretically impossible anyway, so that's his answer about the phone call scenario. It's really one person, but two temporal parts. Okay, so last thing is this. What about that situation of Tim wanting to go back and kill his grandfather? Okay, so the situation mentioned by Lewis, which I briefly talked about at the end of last lecture, was this. Say that you got a guy who wants to go back in time to kill his own grandfather, but the thing is he wants to kill this grandfather so far back in the past that the grandfather never even yet fathered the child that would become his parent later. So it sounds like it's puzzling, because one way of looking at it is he should be able to succeed because he's there and he has the means and the desire to commit this act of assassination. But at the other hand, it seems like he should not be able to succeed because that would contradict the whole timeline of events. How can a person whose birth was prevented by the murder successfully take a trip to the past? Their birth having been annulled by the act would seem to have made it impossible for them to have committed the act. So what's the right answer? Could he do it or could he not? David Lewis says the most reasonable answer is that he's not going to be able to succeed, because in the universe that we have, the birth of the time traveler was already secured, and therefore it cannot be eliminated later. So the sequence of events is already fully set out, and we already know how this story ends with the eventual birth of the grandson. So try as he might, he's destined to fail in his attempt. Now, to help explain why it seems like both he can and also that he can't, David Lewis introduces this little notion of an ambiguity concerning the word can. Okay, so he says there's two senses of the same word can. Two senses of the word can. So he distinguishes the narrow sense from the broad sense. Okay, so the narrow sense of the word means what one is able to do given a more limited or narrower set of facts. Okay, what one is able to do based on a narrow or limited range of facts. Okay, and then the broad sense is just the contrary. So this sense of the word can refers to what one is able to do based on a more inclusive, or you could say broad set of facts. Okay, so what one is able to do on a broader range of facts. So, to reinforce the understanding of this, here's the example that he gives. Okay, so let me try and give you this example. I'm going to ask you a question, and just tell me what you think would be your most natural answer to this question. Can you speak Russian? Okay, that's a straight question. Can you speak Russian? If you don't overthink it much, what would be the most basic response you might give to this question to anybody who asks you? Can you speak Russian? Okay, and so you're saying no. That makes perfectly good sense, right? But let me ask this question again, and now I'm going to ask it in a way that's going to maybe lead to yet a different answer. Okay, so let me pose it to you this way. Compared to a dog, can you speak Russian? If I'm comparing and contrasting you against like a house pet, dog or cat, can you speak Russian in comparison to the dog? What do you think? We got a dog, we got you. And looking at those two examples, can you speak Russian? Yes. Okay. Now, let's think about the difference in your two answers. When you started and said, no, you can't, you're thinking about just these very specific facts about yourself that you've not, well, you could tell me actually. I'd like to hear it from you. Why do you initially say, no, you can't? I mean, just the obvious reasons. When you say you cannot, what is the facts that you're referring to such that you say, no, I can't? Like, what makes you say you can't? Why not? Because, just tell me. You can't speak Russian, sort of, in one sense of the word can. So when you say you cannot, you mean what? That why not? What does it mean when you say no? That you would not be able to hold a conversation in it, that you don't know the language. Kenzie, you're giving me, I think, the best response here, that you don't right now know about the language. That as of today, you have not yet embarked on a course of study to master and acquire this language, right? So you've not yet, taken Russian, intro to Russian, Russian 1, Russian 2, Russian 101. So you've not been exposed to the information or taught it, right? But when you say that in comparison to a dog, that you can, now you're looking at a bigger picture set of facts, right? So what is meant when one says they can, in contrast to a dog? When one says that they can in that sense, what do they mean? Why can they, according to that way of looking at our question? Just help me out with that. What would one be saying if they claimed that, well, in comparison to a dog, I can, yes. Okay, compared to a dog, you can recognize Russian and repeat the word. No, that's not really it. It's the ability to learn it, okay? So we're not just talking about like miming the words, like reading them off of a screen and not knowing what they mean. I'm talking about like learning it. So yes, it's possible to learn. You have the human intellect, and therefore you're just as well able to learn the language as anybody else who learns a second language. So when we only look at the limited, narrow circumstances, like you've never studied it yet, then we would say no. But when we take a look at the bigger picture, like after all, you're a human being, and so therefore you have the capacity to speak it eventually if you tried really hard, then we would say you can. So we kind of get to have it both ways. In the narrow sense, no, you can't. But in the big picture, broad sense, yeah, I guess in that sense I can. Okay, it's kind of like if I tell you right now, so I've never run a 5-minute mile. I've gone as fast as I can. 5:25 is my personal best, right? But I like to believe that I can run a 5-minute mile. If I get to the peak of training, then I think that it's something that's within my possible range of ability. But if you say, can I today, given my current fitness and training, I guess no. But can I, in the sense of what I'm able to do if I really work hard at it, then yes. So we can sort of have it both ways in response to a question about what one can do. Now, going back to our example of Tim, okay? Tim wanted to kill his grandfather. And we said, well, when you look at it one way, it seems like he can. But then when you look at it another way, it seems like he can't. And that's where this kicks in. So Tim just arriving in the past with a rifle, trying to shoot at his grandfather. When you just look at the fact that he's there and that he has the means and motive, just looking at those limited, narrow set of facts, it seems like, yeah, he can. But then when you take a step back and you look at the whole timeline of events as it is bound to play out, you would say that because Tim eventually is born, and therefore nothing that would have prevented his birth ever did happen, that in that larger scale assessment of the situation, no, he can't. So we kind of get to say, yes, in one sense, he can if you just limit yourself to the awareness of what he's doing and trying to do. But when you look at the bigger picture of all the set facts and the way that the story is going to end, then it would seem like he can't. Now, here's where I would like to close this discussion of time travel right now and time overall for our class. Whenever the subject gets taught, I could sympathize with a student who would think these thoughts. But how is this really too relevant to my everyday life? I mean, time travel is very far out there. It's a purely theoretical, hypothetical thing. So why should I spend much time thinking about these concepts? Well, one of the, I would say, interesting metaphysical connections to your everyday life is this. You think that you have free will. And so you think that there's all kinds of stuff that even if you didn't do it, you could have done it because you're free, right? But if this space-time theory is correct, then actually you're locked into only one timeline. And therefore, whatever is going to happen to you is already fully set out in the overall structure of space-time. So let me ask you a question. You're not, time traveling Tim, but just you watching this live stream. I know you're watching it right now if you're hearing me speak these words. So let's ask about this. Could you have missed today's lecture? do you think that it could have happened that you were not watching this? I know you are watching it, but do you think you could have not attended this live stream? What's your feeling on that? Do you think you could have not been watching this right now? I don't know. So yes is your first thought, right? Yes. But when you say that you could have not watched this lecture, okay, you're thinking about can in the narrow sense, okay? Because what you're thinking about are these things. Well, maybe I could have just decided to spend my afternoon doing something else, or maybe I could have overslept, or maybe I could have decided I'd just watch the replay at a later time. Those all things could have happened, but I just chose to watch it. So I'm watching it, but I might not have. But according to the space-time theory, there's a way of looking at your situation that you literally could not have avoided watching this lecture. Why not? Why do you think that, according to an understanding that we've tried to develop about space-time theory, that in a way you really couldn't have missed this lecture? Because, why? Well, because as we've already said, there's no open future according to this theory. All the events of space-time are fully contained and enclosed within the overall structure of the entire universe. So since you're watching it right now, that means that this event in your timeline of existence was always there and was always going to happen and is eternal. So in that case, you're actually not able to do anything except for the things that you actually do. And that's where I find that this becomes very trippy and kind of mind-blowing, because when you think about your own future, you kind of think about open-ended possibilities of anything happening. Like there's 5, 10, 20, 100 different options for me, and which one happens is something that's just up to me and it's totally undetermined. But if the space-time theory is correct, then the idea of these alternative possibilities is really just an illusion in your mind. There's only one outcome, and it's the actual set of events that takes place. All the counterfactual events are just mere fictions. So isn't that weird, right? It would imply that the future events of your own existence are fully set out and set forth, and therefore you're destined to experience them in whatever order. So I guess this lecture part of your timeline was always going to happen, and there's no way you possibly could have avoided it. And I think that's interesting when it comes to being a teacher of philosophy, because when I teach people like earlier in the semester about contingent truth, and I say, here's something that could have not happened. It did happen, but it might not have, like the outcome of the election, or the existence of this dangerous virus, or even your own birth. We say it's contingent because maybe it could not have happened. And sometimes I encounter a little intellectual resistance from students that are like, well, what do you mean could have not happened, but it did happen? So then you become kind of deflationary about the idea of these counterfactuals. But then when I tell you now, like, you don't have free will, and there's only one thing that can possibly happen, there's no counterfactuals, now you're going to be the philosopher that says, oh, but think of all the possible worlds where I slept through this lecture. Or think of another possible world in which I never even was a student at Fullerton. But now you're the one that's using the idea of these mental constructs, these other possible scenarios, to justify your belief that there's actually free will. So which one is it? It's a tough debate. I'm not 100% sure whether the space-time theory is correct, or more traditional, linear conceptions of time are actually the right ones. But if it is true, if the space-time theory is true, then it has a really significant metaphysical consequence, which is that all the moments of your own existence are predetermined. So I just wish all of you guys good luck, because you're kind of, in that case, just moving along the conveyor belt of life and destined to undergo the events of your full future in the order already set forth. So Abraham, you say, so the idea of it was meant to be is kind of real. Yeah, in a sense. The idea of fate, predestination, is something that can be found within the scientific description of space-time, yes. And that is one point of contact, I would say, between certain religious perspectives and then like a really heavy scientific secular perspective. Because if you believe in God, then God controls everything, and he's got a plan for you, and nothing that ever happens is going to take him by surprise. So that would be one way of looking at God's providence as providing the set facts that will develop in life and in the universe. But in a scientific way of looking at it, perhaps it's just the natural laws and the nature of space-time that fully subsumes all aspects of your existence. So there's kind of this like hope for providence from either the universe or God in either way of looking at it. But they're not the only viewpoints that do exist. Some people would reject either claim and affirm the reality of human free will. But that's all I wanted to say about the time material. And now that we're good on that, it's past due that we move on. Okay, so we're going to start speaking about a new subject now, and we'll definitely come back to this and we can discuss it more later. But I'm moving on, and I'm going to start talking to you guys now about the next big topic. So it's the philosophy of mind. Okay, so there's a lot of big subjects in philosophy, and we've already studied some of the big ones: philosophy of religion, ethics, epistemology, metaphysics of time. Now we're moving on to this new subject, and that's, as you see it, the philosophy of mind. So another interesting subject of philosophical analysis and exploration is the mind. And so this part of philosophy is all about consciousness, the mental life of an individual, your thoughts, feelings, perceptions, experiences. What's the deal with them? Where are they coming from? Is it just based on the brain? Or is there something that is like spiritual or not physical when it comes to your consciousness and thought? Okay, so the existence of the mind, the existence of consciousness, is one of the most unique and fascinating things in the universe. Imagine a universe where there's no consciousness. Okay, and I mean, according to science, that very easily could have happened, because it's believed in that scientific account that there was no life at the beginning of the universe, and it took a long time for the conditions to arise which would permit the existence of life. But imagine if, for the sake of discussion, life never did develop in this whole universe. Then it would be a big universe with physical objects bouncing into each other, planets, stars, collections of gas, matter. But there would be no perception. There would be no beings there looking at things, experiencing things, judging them, and having feelings. So me and you are conscious beings. It's different than being like, let's say, this eraser, which is just an inert, material object that's inanimate. Me and you don't just sit there and have mass, but we actually think, feel, perceive, have hopes, dreams, fears. The inner life of your mind and consciousness is now the subject that we want to study here for a little bit. So what's the nature of consciousness? What's the deal with it? There's some big questions that the philosophy of mind wants to ask. So I'm going to put some of these major questions of the philosophy of mind on the board. Okay, so some of the big questions include these three that I'm going to put below. For one, are the mind and the brain two different things, or are they the same thing? Okay, that's one big question that this philosophy of mind is interested in. So there's the brain, right? Everyone knows you have a brain up here in your head. That's spongy organ of the body that's responsible for consciousness. It's like the seat of your perception and everything else. But when it comes to your consciousness, is it just the brain? Is it just the physical brain that is responsible for consciousness and there's nothing else besides that? Or could it be claimed that the mind, which thinks and feels and etc., is different from the brain? Could it be that there's like a soul or a spirit that is somehow distinct from the physical object in the skull, so that there could even be consciousness without the existence of the body? Is that possible or not? Because, right, some people think that consciousness is merely the physical behavior of the brain. And if that's your view, then you would say that consciousness cannot exist without a functioning brain. But on the other hand, some people think that consciousness is something that goes beyond the physical, that it's somehow something that could exist in a fully disembodied state, like a soul or a spirit or an immaterial ghost that is able to think, feel, and judge, but doesn't even have any connection to a physical body. So some people think the mind is beyond the physical, but some people think it's merely the brain, and that's one question that we're going to examine on both sides. Now, another question that's kind of related to this, similar question. Could consciousness be explained physically? Okay, so consciousness, like I mean, right now, what you're experiencing, being able to perceive this lecture and hear my voice and see the image on the screen, is it something that can be reduced totally to the physical? Is it just neurochemistry, like the neurons and synapses of the brain firing? Is that the whole story of how consciousness works? Or is there something about it that defies a purely reductive physical analysis? Is there something about consciousness, maybe because it's so rich, because it has subjectivity? Is there something about that that will never be capable of being explained on a totally physical basis, or not? Is it all just physical all the way down, or are there some aspects or elements of consciousness that resist physical description? Okay, and that's kind of a piece with the first question you see there. And the third big question that we're also going to touch on as we get through these lectures, I'll just put it here since we see the topic heading above. We've already written that down. Another one of these big questions is this one: could a machine ever think or have consciousness? Could a machine ever have consciousness? Another big question that the philosophy of mind tries to ask. And it's becoming, of course, increasingly interesting, this question, as we make better and better progress to more sophisticated artificial intelligence systems and interactive virtual assistants and chatbots and things like that. So some people think that it's not inconceivable to build machines that have the same kind of consciousness that we have. But not everybody agrees with that. So there's a divide among different philosophers and scientists. Some people think that it's possible to develop computing systems that are so sophisticated that they start to exhibit actual consciousness and perception like what we have. Other people think that's not possible. Other people say even if you built the most sophisticated system where it has total behavioral similarity to a human being, like, you're dealing with a robot and you're asking the robot how it feels, and it just says, I don't know, I'm feeling kind of depressed. Do you want to talk about it? And you guys build a friendship, and it cries, and it discusses its inner life, the complex thoughts and feelings that it has. Would it really be a conscious being though, or would it just be a very sophisticated computer program with no inner thought, feeling, or experience? So there are different positions people have on that. And what we will eventually study are the words of Alan Turing, who created the digital computer. And he wrote a paper back in 1950 where he argued that he thinks, yes, eventually computers will be able to think and have consciousness. But we'll also learn about what the criticisms and objections are to that whole idea. So it's philosophy of mind. That's this week, and maybe even one meeting next week it'll spill into. But that's an important topic for us to try and get clear on. Now, in the philosophy of mind, as in every topic of philosophy, there are various different positions that people take, and not everyone is on the same page. So like in philosophy of religion, some people provide arguments for the existence of God, other people criticize those. In ethics, some people are consequentialist utilitarians, some people are deontological Kantians, and they argue for the better quality of their ethical theory. In epistemology, there's some people that think it's justified true belief that defines knowledge. And then you have Gettier and others that say, no, this is not the right definition. Here, look at these examples. And then when it comes to the metaphysics of time, we saw some people adhere to the Newtonian theory, where time's linear and it's unaffected by space. Then you have Einstein's theory of space-time, which is far different from that. So once again, we're going to be treated to a couple of alternative views in the philosophy of mind. And so there's two main positions, and let me put that here. So I'm going to erase this part of the board, and I'm going to write up there two main positions in the philosophy of mind. Once I need to, trust me, I'll move Kitty, but for the time being, I'm trying to just let her do her thing. So two main positions in the philosophy of mind. Okay, so there's monism, and then there is what's called dualism. Okay, so let me move her down. I'm sorry, Katie. Huh? Want to go down? Huh? Let's go. Okay. Sorry for that. You know, I never thought that I would ever be teaching philosophy with my cat all in the mix. I mean, that's just, you know, life comes at you fast. But back to this. So there's two main positions in the philosophy of mind, monism and dualism. First of all, monism is this view. It says that everything in the whole universe is just made out of one kind of substance. Okay, so that's the view. I'll put it up here on the board. Everything in the universe is built out of only one kind of substance. So that's the claim of monism. One substance makes everything. Not two, not three, not zero, just one. So I know it's a little not as legible as it could be, but the words say this: monism. Everything in the universe is made out of only one kind of substance. Now, contrast to that, dualism, which says that there's two substances that make everything. So that's the other idea. Everything in the universe is made out of two different types of substance. Out of two kinds of substance. So, in monist thought, it's all made out of one thing. In dualist thought, there's two different types of substances that build everything out. Now, what are these different substances that are being mentioned in the various two ideas here? Okay, so here are these substances that are being spoken about. One of them is called just physical matter. So, substances is what I'm defining for you here above. So one of them, physical matter. And what's the definition of physical matter? So it's just anything that is extended in space, meaning that it just occupies space. It takes up some volume, some region. It has some mass. So it's just anything that is extended in space. And let me write that down. So extension in the usage of philosophers and physicists refers to an object just having some non-zero occupation of space. What do you guys think is the minimal unit of space, or sorry, of physical matter? Thank you. So physical matter is one of the substances we're defining here. And you've heard about the idea of matter or mass. What is the typical word that is used to refer to the most minimal element of matter? So when you break things down further and further and further, you get to this least element, which they call, what's the word? Matter is ultimately built out of little atoms, right? So yes, correct. Atoms we can think of as the little Lego building blocks of reality. Now, of course, in a more heavy physics class, they might talk to you about subatomic particles and quarks, but we're just going to use the common usage of atoms. Okay, so I'll put in parentheses here really quick that in the end, this physical matter is basically all atoms. So one viewpoint within monism is that that's the only kind of substance, that everything's made out of matter. But if a thing is made out of physical matter, then it's extended in space, and that means it takes up some room and it has some mass, weight, volume, and so forth. It would displace water to some extent. And the ultimate building block of that physical matter are atoms. That's one of the possible substances. The other one, though, which is also mentioned here, is mind. So there's basically mind and matter. Mind, as it's described by these theories, is not extended in space and is thinking. Okay, so not extended in space, not extended. and is thinking. Okay, not extended, and thinks. So mind is described as basically like not the brain, which is made out of matter, but something that is totally lacking in substance of a material kind and formless. So what we're talking about here is like a consciousness with no physical appendages or existence in the physical realm. So it's a purely thinking thing that's immaterial and disembodied. It's kind of like a ghost or a soul or a spirit. It's like the kind of idea of a consciousness that doesn't depend on the existence of the body or the brain. So now, monism says that the whole universe and every single thing within it is made out of just one of those two kinds of substances, and dualism embraces both. So the prefix of the word monism is mono, which does mean one. Like monogamy is to have one partner. Monologue in theater is an actor on the stage giving a soliloquy by themselves, so one person. Mono speakers are just having one audio channel as opposed to stereo, which is two. So monism holds that prefix because it does say that everything's just made out of one substance. And dualism, with the word duo implied by the prefix, means two. So now, there are two kinds of monism, depending on which one of these two substances the specific monist thinks composes everything. So now I'm going to talk to you about two types of monism. Okay, so two types of monism. Okay, so we're starting off this topic of philosophy of mind, just kind of getting some good vocabulary established. What I've said so far is that this whole field of investigation is all about examining and exploring the nature of consciousness and the inner life of the mind. Two big positions in this field are monism and dualism. Monism says everything's made out of one kind of substance. Dualism says that two substances build everything up. And now here are the two different substances that are eligible candidates to be one of the types of substances that makes everything or jointly composes everything. So now two types of monism. The first one is called physicalism. You need to number it because that's been implied. So physicalism. Now you can probably guess that the physicalist monists, they say that every single thing in the universe is made out of which of the two substances? Well, the name is a dead giveaway. The physicalist monist says it's all made out of matter. Everything is made out of physical matter. Basically, it's all made out of atoms in the end. But that's not just saying that some things are made out of matter. It's saying everything is. Even me and you, even our mind, even our consciousness, it's all just made out of physical material, basically physical atoms. So physicalism says that everything in the universe is made out of physical matter, including us and our consciousness. Including, and this is key, including us and our consciousness. So that's one of the two branches of monism. Okay, so some monists who say that everything's made out of only one substance are saying specifically that it is all made out of the physical matter type of substance. And so according to that viewpoint, there is no thing at all that is not physical. Everything is physical, and there is not one thing that isn't. And that means that even your mind and your thoughts, your feelings, your perceptions, hopes, dreams, fears, whatever, those are all just physical processes of the physical brain, which is just made out of matter. So the physicalist would say there's nothing beyond the brain when it comes to consciousness. There's not like some kind of otherworldly soul or spirit that inhabits the body, but there's just the brain and its neurochemistry and biology. So if you were a physicalist, then you would say, if there's not a brain which is functioning, then there cannot be consciousness. The physicalist would deny that there could be a disembodied consciousness just sort of floating free from a body, that in the absence of the brain and its correct, proper working order, there would not be consciousness. So they deny the existence of anything that is supernatural or non-physical when it comes to thought and perception. So yeah, you've got consciousness right now, but that's because the brain is operating, and as they say, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. So death, which would ultimately reduce any physical system to the disassembly of its parts over time, would destroy the possibility of consciousness continuing to exist. So that's one type of viewpoint about consciousness and the mind. It's called physicalism. And it says that everything's made out of matter. Even things like thoughts and feelings are just basically ultimately made out of the byproducts of the brain processes, which are just matter and material. But that's not the only kind of monism. At the same time, though, it's the most popular kind of monism. So we're mostly going to, when we speak of monism in this class, we're mostly going to be referring to this type, the physicalist type. But I'm also going to briefly set aside the other kinds, just so that we all know what it is. So another type of monism is out there, and it's called idealism. Idealism, as you might expect, is just the one that says, no, it's not made out of matter, but everything's made out of mind. So according to idealism, everything is made out of ideas. Everything in the universe is made out of ideas. And so, according to that perspective, there's actually no such thing as matter. There's no such thing as mass or matter. There's just thoughts and ideas. So according to the idealist monist, you know, this table, chair, the objects, the furniture surrounding me, they're just thoughts. There's no actual like solid material substance to them. They appear to exist as objects because they're thoughts that are being had by the mind. And so in idealism, there's no matter. There's all just thoughts, and minds have these thoughts. Now, look, most people don't take this idealist version of monism as very seriously. After all, you know, we have had a lot of success in the physical sciences, and in the year 2020, it's been relegated almost to non-existence. Most people don't take it very seriously, but there are some interesting authors from a couple centuries back, George Berkeley, Christian bishop, who wrote some very detailed arguments to try and make the case for idealism. Now, you might be thinking, if idealism is true, then what happens to the objects when nobody's perceiving them? You know, like they say on the surface of the moon, we put the American flag, and of course we did do that. But if that's all just made out of ideas, then what about when nobody's on the surface of the moon looking at that object? Does it just not exist? Does it just pop out of existence when it's not being thought of or perceived or whatever? Well, the most sophisticated versions of idealism say that when no individual is around to perceive an object, God is the perceiver who keeps it out there existing for as long as he wants. So like, you know, the flag on the moon's surface is still there, and it has its own kind of mind-independent existence, but only because God is the ultimate thinker. And as long as he wishes, he can keep things suspended in reality by continuing to have the idea of them. But anyway, like I'm telling you, don't worry too much about idealism. I'm not going to make a big deal out of it, but I just kind of wanted you guys to understand that when it comes to monism, there are these two distinct brands or flavors of monism. Most monists today, I'm telling you, if they are physicalists. But there are some individuals that hold to the other perspective, which is idealism. Now, dualism, okay, is the big contrast to both versions of monism. And what dualists say is that it's not just all made out of matter, nor is it just only made out of mind, but that reality, this whole universe, is built out of both kinds of substance. So within dualism, they say there's both. What about you? Your body is obviously an object made out of matter. You know, we got flesh and blood, and we have mass, volume, shape, size, right? But the dualist would say there's more to you just than the physical body. You also have this immaterial thinking mind, which is more like a soul or a spirit, and it's not made out of atoms, it's not made out of matter, and therefore it can either be created nor destroyed, and it's somehow immaterial and it can survive the destruction or annihilation of the physical body. So that's dualism. Now, people on either side of this debate have powerful arguments for their position, and that's what's coming next. So we're going to try and learn what are the arguments given by dualists to try and establish that that's true, and then what are the arguments that are given by physicalists to try and debunk or dispute the case for dualism. So we're going to hear from both types of author, and the first look at this is going to be from Descartes, actually. So Descartes is a dualist. Therefore, we're going to get started on this whole monism-dualism debate by examining an argument for dualism that is given by our friend Rene Descartes, the famous French philosopher of the 17th century. So we read the first two meditations of his big book, The Meditations, a couple weeks back when we were studying epistemology. And like I told you then, there are 6 chapters of his book, 1 through 6. So now we're going back to the Meditations one more time to look at some information in Meditation 6, the last one. Okay, so I'm going to erase all this stuff here and just try to get a little bit on the table for dualism and Descartes. And then we'll just continue rolling into the next meeting next time. It's crazy that I'm seeing like 72 people viewing this lecture. I don't know. Maybe it's catching on. Got 85. Wow, I've never seen numbers like that. So I don't know. This is people that are not even in our class, but hello, everybody out there. Hope you guys are doing great, whoever you are. All right, cool. So next up, Rene Descartes. So we may remember some of these dates from previously, but he's a man that lived from 1596 until 1650, and he wrote the book Meditations in 1641. And basically what we're looking at here, yeah, I see a lot of those viewers are in there. What we're looking at is Meditation 6, the last chapter. And there we find Descartes' big argument for dualism, okay? So he's a dualist, and he makes sure to tell the reader that he defines, yes, it is getting into what were the order of prompts? I don't remember if it was 1 or 2, but basically, yes, one of the prompts is about the philosophy of mind, and it asks you to consider the difference between monism and dualism, talk about supervenience, which is what's coming up. So yes, there's definitely material here that's relevant to the prompt on philosophy of mind. That's true. Good question, Kenzie. Okay, so back to Descartes. He defines the physical as that which is extended in space, and things that are not extended in space are non-physical. Let me read to you a little bit of the text so you can hear him say this. Here on page 553, here's what it says. It remains for me to examine whether material things exist, and at least I now know they are capable of existing, insofar as they are the subject matter of pure mathematics, since I perceive them clearly and distinctly. So here he continues, for there is no doubt that God is capable of creating everything that I am capable of perceiving in this manner, and I have never judged that something could not be made by him except on the grounds that there would be a contradiction in my perceiving it distinctly. The conclusion that material things exist is also suggested by the faculty of imagination. So I'm going on a little bit further here. I consider this power of imagining which is in me differing as it does from the power of understanding. I'm just trying to find the one part where he talks about the distinction between body and mind. But besides this, the corporeal nature, which is the subject matter of pure mathematics. I'm going to have to find that quote later, but oh, here we go. I've got it. I perceived by the senses that I had a head, hands, feet, and other limbs making up the body, which I regarded as part of myself, and outside me besides the extension, shapes, and movement of bodies. Here we go. The question, thus, so this is on page 556. Sorry, guys, for the little delay in finding the quote. But it says here, On the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself insofar as I'm simply a thinking, non-extended thing. On the other hand, I have a distinct idea of body insofar as this is simply an extended, non-thinking thing. So body is sometimes the term he uses to refer to matter, and he's saying that that is defined as something that is extended and not thinking. Mind, on the other hand, is defined as something that lacks extension and is capable of thinking. Yeah, and anybody, hey, watching this, 291 viewers, please subscribe. You can comment if you like, as long as you keep it academic. Thank you. But anyway, Meditation 6 contains this argument for dualism, and it's a long-winded argument. It's containing a lot of premises, so I'm going to actually have to probably delay the full presentation of it until the top of next meeting. But let me kind of walk you guys through it just verbally one time so that when we go back on Wednesday, you have some reference to draw from it, okay? So what Descartes begins by saying is that, remember the method of doubt? The method of doubt says to assume that something's false if there's even any possibility that it could be false. Okay, so when you're using that method of doubt, according to it, we're capable of doubting everything that we've perceived with the five senses because it could all just be seen or perceived within a dream. So with the method of doubt, you're able to doubt the existence of all things perceived by the senses, and even, he says, math and logic. Because in math and logic, he says there could be an external source of deception like an evil demon. But nonetheless, he says that using the method of doubt, one thing remains totally certain. Does anybody remember what that is? Something that is still certain and cannot be doubted by anybody. What does your memory remember about that from Descartes? Descartes said, here's something that cannot possibly be doubted. Even the method of doubt can't touch it. And it's the knowledge that that yes, you say, Anthony, existence, but it's the knowledge of whose existence? Let's just be clear. You know that what exists? What is it? You could tell me. Yes, you know you exist. And how is it known by you to be totally certain? Because even thinking anything establishes the existence of your consciousness. So you think, therefore, you are. Okay, good. So I'm just going to talk us through a few of the steps of the argument, and I will fully write it on the board next time as we begin. But anyway, a little preview. So using the method of doubt, you can doubt everything you perceive with your five senses, even math and logic. But one thing you can't doubt is that you exist because you are thinking. Okay, so now we got one thing that we know for sure, and that's that you exist, at least. Okay, so from there, the next step he takes is this. In your mind, there are ideas. Since you know you exist, and at least you exist as a mind, one thing that you can say safely is that you have ideas in your mind. Okay, so among the ideas that there are in your mind, he says there's one that kind of is unique and special, better maybe than all the rest. I don't know if I should say better, but it's unique among the rest. It's the idea of who or what do you think? Descartes says there's this one idea in the mind of each person. It's kind of almost similar to Anselm, so that's a hint. But he says one idea that is placed in every human being's mind is the idea of the great, what is it? Let's just see if you can judge what maybe he's going for here. So like in our steps of the argument, we've just established that maybe everything can be doubted except that you exist. And at a minimum, you know you are thinking thoughts. One of the thoughts that you're thinking about in the mind is the idea of a very special thing. What do you think it could be? Mentioned by this man Descartes in 1641. Each of us has a very powerful idea of this specific thing that's a very great thing, maybe greater than anything. What could it be? Just a question. What do you think? It's an idea of a being. What being do you think is being talked about? Yes, that's right, God. Consciousness, it's a good attempt, but no, he's talking about God, actually. So what he says is this. You know you exist because you're thinking, right? That's I think, therefore I am. Everything else is off to the side for now. We're not sure, but one thing can be sure, and that's that you exist because you're thinking. Then he says, well, what am I thinking of? I'm thinking about lots of stuff, but one thing I'm thinking about in my mind is the idea of God. Okay, that's his leverage. That opens the sort of door to a lot of additional results that follow after that. because he basically says, look, if you have an idea of God, well, what idea is that? It's the idea of a perfect, infinite being. And he says that's an idea which is an idea of an infinite thing. And what he says is that an idea of an infinite being can only happen if there actually is something that is infinite that causes you to have the idea. So he basically thinks just because we have the idea of God, he therefore has to exist. It's kind of almost similar to the ontological argument, slight differences, but the basic upshot is the idea of God is just too great and infinite to be something that's not real. Since you have the idea, and since it's in the head, it has to be traced to some source that is just as great as the idea. So there really has to be a God. And then that leads him to a couple of additional claims. Once he says, okay, now I've proven that God exists, he says God would never deceive me or anybody because he's too good for that. So if God is real and he's perfectly good, that means that he would not allow me to be wrong when I have clear and distinct perceptions. So now we've gotten to the steps in the argument where Descartes says that clear and distinct perceptions have to be true, because if they weren't, then God would be manipulating you, and he never would do that because he's perfect. He's perfectly omnibenevolent. So clear and distinct perceptions have to be true, and that really gets us close to the tail end of his argument. He says one clear and distinct perception that you have is that if you can separate two things in your thought, then they could really be separated in reality. Like I'm wearing these glasses, right? But do I really have to take them off for you to be able to imagine me not wearing them? Certainly you can imagine that, and that's clear, which shows that I can actually be separated from the glasses. Let me demonstrate, you see? Now, what Descartes is saying then is that if you can imagine clearly in the mind two things existing separate from each other, then they must really be able to be separated, because God guarantees that these clear and distinct perceptions must be true. And he then says you can clearly and distinctly imagine the mind and the body existing separately. Like you can imagine yourself not even having a body and still thinking, because, for example, perhaps the body itself is just a dream. So since the body can be doubted but not the mind, there's room to doubt the existence of one and not the other. Therefore, there's separability of the two. Since they can be clearly and distinctly individuated in thought, they can really exist separately in reality. And that's basically dualism there. So it's this kind of long and winding argument that starts from the method of doubt, proceeds through the proof of God's existence based on the knowledge of your own existence, and then gets from there to his good, perfect benevolence, his non-deceptiveness, and that leads us in the direction of thinking that he provides us with knowledge that the mind and body are separate. And if they weren't, then he would be deceiving us because he makes that seem so clearly conceivable. There's more to say on this Descartes stuff, but I'm happy that we did get to cover, at least in this sketchy discussion way, the first gloss of the argument, because it kind of takes two passes to fully, I think, digest. So now you've gotten the verbal presentation on Wednesday. I'll just write those notes up, and then we'll move quickly to Daniel Stoljar and JJC Smart. So I'd like you guys to try, if you can, to read Stoljar and Smart for Wednesday, and then we're just going to continue moving through the syllabus based on the dates that you saw listed there, together with my notification over the weekend that we're going to compress some of the materials to try and get as much of it in as we can before finals week. All right, guys. Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer. Thanks a lot for your attendance today. Good meeting, great contribution from everybody, and I hope you're doing really well, staying healthy, safe, and enjoying yourself the best you can. Maybe you guys, if you're fans of basketball, you're watching that Jordan documentary. I definitely was watching it last night. That was pretty cool. But anyways, have a good one. Take care, everybody, and I'll see you back on Wednesday. Thanks so much.